It's a great honor to be the first speaker, and this, I think it's going to be a really great and important event. I'm Sean Smith. I coordinate a network of 89 unions from 26 countries called Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. We set it up to fight for public ownership of energy, to reclaim energy in public ownership, and to defend energy from privatization. And we felt if you can't control the energy system, you will not be able to control the climate. It's as simple as that. And what has happened with the privatization agenda is it's marketized and commodified energy in a way that the more you use, the more money is made by corporations. This has to stop, and it's part of the theme, I think, today, is how do we really drive forward a just transition? And of course, there are many different components, and the three I think that stand out are mobilization, which we saw a tremendous showing of popular force, if you like, a couple of days ago in this city. What a fantastic demonstration with so many young people involved. We know it takes organization. I want to congratulate the organizers of the coalition and the work that's being done in this country, in this city, in recent times over the question of just transition, bringing unions and their allies together. But I want to focus a little bit on the question of implementation, because this, I think, is somewhere where we need to do more work, and some of that work is already beginning to happen. I'll come back to that in a moment. First of all, I want to say that my father was born in the city, and he was from Irish background. He worked on shipyards, and he ended up being conscripted into the British Army in 1939 to fight World War II. So I have an emotional connection to this town and for the traditions of the Red Clydeside of recent decades. And I think those traditions are very important when we're looking about, when we examine what we need to do as a movement or as a group of movements in order to make change happen. So speaking of change, we saw many, many banners, thousands of banners calling for system change, not climate change. But what do we mean by system change, and how do we achieve it? We know that the current system is based on growth without end. And for many years, it was put forward that we can have growth, but what we need to do is to price the externalities, which is what economists were calling carbon dioxide and other emissions. If they were priced, then there would be a disincentive to use them. The other piece of that policy was to incentivize renewable energy and other low carbon solutions. I think the last 20 years have shown us that these two policies have been a monumental failure. First of all, there is no carbon price that's effective, and where prices are introduced, they are passed down to workers, as we saw in the yellow vest struggle in France a couple of years ago. I wonder why workers have no confidence in leaders when it comes to handling the climate emergency. We've also seen billions, hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars moving from public money to private interest in the form of subsidies for the large renewable energy companies who are not climate warriors. They are enemies of the climate in the same way as the fossil fuel companies are. We should break with any illusions we might have in the fact that they are somehow our friends. But how do we deal with this monumental failure? The policy failure of neoliberal energy and climate. It's been a complete disaster. Look, I remember COP15 in Copenhagen 12 years ago. We called for more ambition. We got more ambition. We called for more ambition. We got more ambition. Countries have stepped up, saying we will be net zero by 2050, 2060, and that's more ambition. We asked for more political will. They sent us the memo. Here's your political will. But what we don't have, and what they can't produce, is a way of delivering on the targets. This is the fundamental reality that we're facing at the moment. They can make a target, but they won't meet it. And the reason why they won't meet it is because they have no way of dealing with the growth dynamics of capitalism and its ongoing use of energy. What we said in Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, and it's not a popular analysis, but it's the truth. We are not seeing an energy transition. We are seeing an energy expansion at the global level, where more and more fossil fuels are being used every year, alongside growing levels of renewable power. But the growing levels of renewable power is not sufficient to stop the growth in the increase in fossil fuels. Please look at the data and be under no illusions about the transition. When leaders say we've made great progress, but we need to go faster, just throw the facts back on their face. Coal, oil, gas increasing globally. More and more emissions, more and more climate instability. So let me turn finally then to the question of what can we do about it. In the work of the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, we've been partnering with unions and saying it's fantastic that unions are beginning to be part of the climate movement in a serious way. And I can't think of any country in the world where that is better expressed than in Scotland right now. So I think everybody in Scotland should be very proud of the work we've done to do that, to achieve that. But we also need programmatic work. And we're calling for, in this program called the Trade Union Program for a Public Low Carbon Energy Future, which unions like the energy unions in France, PSI, the FNV, which is the National Federation of the Netherlands, the South African Federation of Trade Unions, as well as Unite, PCS, and others here, including the Scottish TUC. That program is calling for a reversal of the neoliberal privatization that took place in the 1980s and 90s to decommodify the electricity system. Because on the basis of the current model, companies make more the more electricity they sell, and electricity is the leading single source of CO2 emissions globally. So if we can't control the use of energy, and electricity being critical to that, we have to decarbonize the supply, but we also have to push energy efficiency and conservation. The only way that can be done is outside the market. This, we believe, is a strategic approach to system change. Because if we have a platform where we control energy, we also should control transport, and we also should control finance. There are many things we need to control. Our work with the unions and Trade Unions for Energy Democracy has been on the question of the power sector in particular. So we urge you to support this strategic effort to try to reverse the neoliberal rules, to decommodify the power system, to use public works program, and I'm sure Ross will talk about this, to retrofit all of the buildings, not just in this country, across the UK and Europe and internationally, will be crucially important. So I think though the struggle that I would like to refer to in closing is the struggle not just of the Upper Clyde shipyards where they occupied and did a working many years ago now, so we're going back to that struggle, but of the Lucas Aerospace plant, where shop stewards and the workers there put together plans of using the technologies of a factory that was threatened with closure for socially necessary and beneficial products. They put that plan together over a period of years. And so the process of implementation system change takes that rigorous work that the whole movement needs to do. And I sense, talking to comrades in Glasgow these last few days, is that is becoming understood by the movement. That we are having conversations now that really prepare us for political power. And our path to power will be cleared if we can answer those difficult questions about what are you going to do about it. Because we know that the people down the road there who are talking about climate carbon pricing and incentivizing and blended finance and you know what, of mobilizing the private sector, that has been an abject failure. We should be clear about it and we should be putting forward our proposals. So I'll stop there. I thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Son. I will also say, obviously, you mentioned the where we are in Dublin, and very appropriately. For people in the room, we're obviously sat down just now in the panel, but elsewhere in Belgium, we could have some historical case studies of worker struggle and transition, including those in the global north as well as the global south, as well for people to interact with in between sessions and things. So feel free to take a look. There are some film trailers upstairs as well. I'll be happy to show you them. But in the meantime, I will pass on to Asad Mehmet, who is the director of Water on Law.
Thank you, and apologies for being stuck in a bit of traffic again here. There's so much to talk about in terms of what the story, because when we talk about a just transition or justice transition, of course we're not talking about simply about how we move away from fossil fuels, right? We're talking about a much deeper and bigger story. So I want to just maybe concentrate, I'm sure you've all heard all about multiple crises, how they're all interlinked, etc. So I'm not going to talk about those. I'm going to just talk about the story that we tell and the story that they tell, right? You might have seen this morning some news saying that if you put the fossil fuel lobbyists together inside their COP negotiations, they would be the biggest delegation, right? They would be bigger than any single country delegation. And for those of you who've been inside the negotiations for the last week, you'll realize that we, civil society, the ears and eyes and voices of citizens around the world have been systematically locked out of those negotiations, locked out of even the building at times, while of course the red carpet has been rolled out for big business. And all the announcements that we saw last week, I mean, all incredible headlines, right? And the stop deforestation, stop coal, etc., etc. All made, not in the UN process, of course, but by big business, the very businesses that have taken this to this edge of catastrophe. And there's a reason for why they're positioning themselves that. Because their story works on lots of different levels, right? On one level, it's all our fault, right? Us individuals, why haven't we done this? And it's on P, for those of you with long memories. Remember, in 2009, we were told, only we moved away and changed our light bulbs. It was the fact that we're using plastic straws. It was our fault that this was a crisis. And of course, that's been repeated again and again. And individual behavior absolutely does matter. But we know that the climate crisis, like all the crises that we face, is a structural crisis. And for too long, we know that the story and the vision that was being put forward by those who purported to be leading this fight was about polar bears and icebergs. I've got nothing against polar bears and icebergs, lovely creatures, but it was never a story of people, right? It was never a story. We were not in it. We didn't have any agency in this. This was something that was going to be solved either by policymakers, climate scientists, somewhere else. And we all know that that's led us now with a window which is rapidly closing, less than 10 years if we want to really keep temperatures below 1.5, and even that is only a 2 in 3 chance. None of us would leave this building, get on a bus or a train, somebody tells you it's a 1 in 3 chance of that bus or a train crashing. But that's what we're telling the majority of the world, right? We're telling the majority of the people who are on the front lines of this climate reality and climate violence. And they, of course, and for them, this fight isn't about something that's happening in the future. It's absolutely happening now. And, you know, and again, I think for a long time, lots of the environment movement, you know, really thought workers were just something you every now and then mention, right? Maybe throw away by, yeah, you'll have good jobs, etc. Forget about it. And now, of course, the word just transition has been, you know, co-opted by absolutely everybody, right? You have our Prime Minister talking about a just transition. You have all these businesses talking about just transition. But we have to reclaim that word, right? We have to really talk about what we mean when we say a just transition. And I think the work that has been done here, the Friends of Scotland, the Just Transition platform, Sean with the TU2 Ed, all around the world, we're seeing exactly the same work. Why? For me, very, very simply, if you want to transform the world, you've got to work with social movements. You've got to work with people who have collective power. There is only one in social movement that is truly global and in its DNA as international. Right? That's of course been the Labour movement. Right? There's a reason why our banners don't say workers of England unite or Scotland, they say workers of the world unite. Right? Because we always understood that whilst our fights were local in terms of changing the lives and realities of trade union members and our communities, they were also about transforming the world. And, you know, one of the things I think neoliberalism has done to all of us, and its greatest probably victory, has not been just the economic deregulation, the forced privatization, the role of the market, etc., and the ravages that we've all seen. It's what it's done to all of us, right? It's taken away our ability to be able to even imagine that there could be something different. That this structure was conceived and put into place. And if it was conceived and put into place, it can also be uprooted, right? And we have to really believe that. And we have to tell a story about that. Tonight, really, the fact that we're here in Dublin, the fact that we're in Glasgow, the fact that there is a very, very different story, right? From Lucas Aerospace, the Lucas plan, to the Red Strikers, to, you know, the Croft. These are our stories. Our stories are not about selfishness. They're not about people turning their backs on each other. They're actually about cooperation and solidarity. And that's a very, very powerful story that we've got to tell. And our vision is not got to be just simply about how are we thinking about fixing the energy system, right? Or how are we thinking about just the workers in the fossil fuel industry and how they transition? Because we know when we talk about a just transition, it's a very, very different kind of transition we're talking about, right? So we have to, you know, and there are very many different frames for this. I mean, we as Warren Moore, we talk about a global Green New Deal. So you have to, this is the moment for us to address the multiple crises, because you have to be able to pull the threads, right? You have to know the system we're trying to change and then think about what that means in these multiple crises. So we've got, of course, a reality of the climate crisis. Less than 10 years, that means rich countries, if they were doing their fair share, would be at zero by 2030. Warren Moore, we've done an estimation, along with friends here in Scotland and others. The UK's fair share, minus 200% by 2030. It's not net zero 2050. It's not banking on unproven and risky technologies. It's not doing all of those. That's tough questions, right? Because that in the Labour movement, what? We're going to decarbonise the whole economy by 2030. What does that mean? And so you can only convince people of the change if, of course, they're part of the story, if they are actually in control of that story, if they can begin to envision what they see and what the world we're fighting for. You know, I always say to environmentalists, there is, you know, the picture of the Gilets Jaunes, the yellow vest, you know, of their first banner should be blown up and posted into every environmental office or any working on climate. When they said the elites worry about the end of the world, we ordinary people, we worry about the end of the month, right? So this question for us is, how do we tackle the climate crisis whilst recognizing that many of our people, of our community, many working people, both in the UK and globally, are barely struggling to survive, right? We have half the world living on the equivalent, not only, but the equivalent of $5, right? That's just on the brink of basically extreme poverty. Now, some people tell you, oh, $1.90, right? That's basically that you're not dying, right? If you want to live with dignity, it's not $10, it's $15 equivalent that you need, right? So we have to think about, so yes, in the UK, we should be fighting for £15 an hour as a living wage, but we should also be fighting for at least $15 a day for workers in the global south, right? So how are we beginning to reimagine this fight so that when they have a global structure, a global economy, multinationals working at a global level, that our movement also works together to build our collective power? Not just saying, well, that's a workers' fight over there, that's nothing to do with it, but how do we begin to weave our different stories together? So we have a set of political demands, absolutely. Look, transitioning the energy system and the food system, the argument that you can move from dirty energy to renewable energy and carry on is just not possible. It's absolutely not possible. You need a massive reduction in the use of energy, something like about 60%. Yet we've got half the world doesn't have electricity and clean cooking. Are we going to say to them, you've got a light bulb or a phone charger? No, people want productive energy, but we know it can be done. Studies have shown we can provide productive energy, enough for all of our public services, for a healthy economy, for 10 million people. What you can't have is wasteful energy. But that means we have to think about transitioning that, and transitioning is not going to come from multinationals. It's got to be democratically owned. It's got to be owned by people, whether it's at the local level or national. That's the only way. You don't have to be ideological now about ownership. It's just got to be very practical. You cannot transition the energy system like you can't transition the food system by simply relying on very people who cause this crisis to say, I will do it, I will do it. And that's what they're trying to do, position themselves in sort of that negotiation. Say, yes, we took you to this brink. Yes, we are responsible for this crisis, but trust us, we'll be the ones who solve it. We have to tie that, of course, with the demands around a living wage, but also universal social protection and public services. Not because they're just good things to have, but it's proven again and again from a climate perspective. When we talk about adaptive measures, the key adaptive measures that determine people's ability to be able to respond to crisis is, do you have access to public services? Do you have social protection? Do you have economic security? Do you have a right to housing and health and education? These are the adaptive measures, right? They're not simply about, are we, building high ceiling walls around, etc., etc. I think we have to change and turn this conversation around. We have to, of course, think about in terms of how do we fix this global economy. We all know, ordinary people in this country, over this last year, if there was ever a reminder of the realities of how the global powers respond to any crisis, then we've seen it in the pandemic, right? We've seen it in this country, who the people who've lost their lives, who've been on the front lines, it's been working people, right? It's exposed all the structural inequalities, the health inequalities that made ordinary working class people but more risk of the pandemic than anybody else. Yes, the middle classes were able to isolate and protect ourselves. And I have underlying health problems. I was able to isolate, but I know my neighbours, they were out working 2-3 different type jobs. They were still working low-paid jobs, right? And the reality, of course, in the global south was we saw our supply chains, our garment industry, for example, simply just lock gates, throw workers onto the scrappy. Hundreds of millions of jobs already lost, hundreds of millions more. But who benefited? The 2,800 billionaires of this world, their income last year increased by $5.5 trillion in 1 year alone. 1 year alone. And that always amazes me. We can't find 100 billion to meet an unmet promise from a decade ago, but suddenly $5.5 trillion. Well, why don't we just tax it? 100% taxation. Why don't we turn the billionaires, even make them millionaires? That would be enough to be able to deal and help finance this transition. We have to also, of course, know that we're going to fix our global trade system. Our trade system is locking in at the very same time as with all of these tough talk on climate change. Our Prime Minister now talks about 1 minute to midnight, that we're on the edge of catastrophe. And we're locking into trade agreements the ability of fossil fuel companies to sue governments if their citizens say we want to move away from that dirty polluting industry. We know this is a moment to transform and fix our global economy. But to do all of those things, we have to build power. And to me, that's the most fundamental question that faces us at this moment. How do we build power? Right? And that's why this just and justice transition story is so incredibly important. Because without that, I don't think we are able to build power. So I want to just very briefly say a couple of words, if that's okay. Just about 1 minute about building power. My other favorite quote, and I have to share this, I want comrades, which I always want to drive home to the environmentalists, mainstream environmentalists, should I say. It's, Chico Mendes, the legendary trade unionist environmentalist, said, ecology or environmentalism without class consciousness is simply gardening. And to me, that is a really, it's not just a throwaway, but it's a really powerful story that actually, unless you've got consciousness, we're not going to be able to build this power. And he was, he was an environmentalist. He was murdered by Brazilian cattle ranch or landowners because of his work protecting the environment. But he understood that this was a question of consciousness, class, and power. And we have to understand it in the same way. And so weaving together our movements, weaving together and building that movement is what is the most and the biggest challenge. And I have to say, on Saturday, when we marched through Glasgow, I've never felt so proud. I've never felt so proud of the change that's even happened in the last few years, that we all collectively have moved the dial, right? Away from talking about empty action to talking about justice, to weaving together and bringing social justice organisations, bringing economic justice organisations, to make the argument, of course, in this country if the government was serious, we'd be retrofitting every home. We'd be immediately retrofitting absolutely every home. We know this winter, lots of people will worry about, should they heat their home, should they put food on their table? We've got over 4 million people using food banks, 2 billion people going hungry around the world. We know that there is a very, very powerful story to be told. But if we don't tell the story, there are other people who will tell the story. And they're already telling a story. And their story is, this is crisis. We can't worry about anybody else. Let's put up the walls. Let's put up the fences. Let's retreat behind the nation state. Let's think about ourselves. Let's think about how we protect our economy, how we can transition. Yes, if that means that we have to start a new wave of green extraction and colonialism. Yes, if that means we have to destroy other people's lives and livelihoods and fuel the planet. That's a necessary price to pay. To undo that is really important, and it feels immense for us. And I will just end with this. Not my favourite person in the world, definitely not, but Milton Friedman, architect of neoliberalism, said, it's only a crisis, real or perceived, that produces real change. And when that crisis happens, it's the plans and policies that lie around that you make from the politically impossible to the politically inevitable. And so whilst our demands at this moment may sound like we're reaching for the sky, actually, that's exactly what we've got to do. We've got to have the courage to reach for the sky.
Always worth it. Thank you. Our next speaker, in the interest of time, we'll just move on, is Ros Hoyer, who's the General Secretary of the Scottish Trade Public College.
Thank you very much. Very, very pleased to be here today at the Just Transition Hub. I think it very much embodies our movement coming together. And when I talk about our movement, I'm talking about our climate justice movement, our social justice movement, and our labour movements coming together to think and talk about just transition and how we achieve that. And we absolutely, as the previous speaker said, have to own and define the term just transition. The term was born in the labour movement. It came out of workers' struggle and workers' solidarity. And I have looked around the meetings at this COP and the amount of corporate giants and governments who are using the term just transition as a throwaway, empty way of, they talk about greenwashing. I think this is sort of social washing their agenda. It makes it even more important that we continue to define that term. And I've been in a number of Scottish Government, Scottish Enterprise, Skills Development Scotland type events over the course of this week, where I've had to very strongly give them the message, nothing about us without us, because it's absolutely crucial that workers' views and the workers who are affected by the transition are at the heart of that debate, and that we have a seat at the table. We need to be in those rooms where those decisions are being made. And that's something that the STUC has been working very hard on in terms of taking our just transition agenda forward in Scotland. So part of what we've been doing, we have been very active in setting up a Just Transition Commission along with Friends of the Earth Scotland, along with the Scottish Government, to really talk about the transition and how it affects people. But I want to be really clear, it is not just about talking about the transition and which industries are going to need less workers and going to need to be folded, and what are we going to do around the skills agenda for those workers and to transition them successfully, although that is very important. For the STUC, what we're talking about when we're talking about a just transition is a fundamental rethink of how we transition our economy, and that means we need to have a fairer distribution of income, wealth and power to working people, and that means we need to think about democratising our economy here in Scotland, and we need to think about public ownership and actually owning our resources and having a greater say in our resources. Now, I'm very conscious that we've been asked to talk about building power, so I'm going to keep the rest of my contribution to try and talk about some of the ways that we are trying to do that, because there are two levels we need to do this. In all of our countries, we have to engage with our class. We have to engage ordinary workers and ordinary working class people in our communities in this debate, and make sure that we are mobilising around the issues that are affecting them. We need to talk about and be active on the issues that are going to make a material difference to our class, to really build the sort of movement we need to build, and build the awareness we need to build, and the anger and the power. And we also, as we said, at a global level, need to be talking to each other. We need to join up the dots. We need to build our evidence base. We need to highlight where good practice is happening, because it is happening in some places, and we need to share that knowledge, because knowledge is also power, and that will help us build the global movement we need to actually push our political leaders and the billionaires and the bosses to do what they absolutely don't want to do. They're going to have to be dragged kicking and screaming, and we have the power to do that. So what we've been doing here in Scotland is really starting to engage around issues that we feel are making a difference. And the areas that we've really focused on in the run-up to the COP are around jobs, looking at that whole energy and infrastructure, and making sure that we're making the arguments that it's not good enough just to have a transition, but it has to be a transition that creates real jobs, and not just any jobs, but high quality, unionised jobs based on the principles of fair work. And if you look at Scotland, there is no just transition so far that we can see, and we've been absolutely scathing actually of government at times about their ability thus far to deliver a just transition, particularly in the energy sector. Because what we've seen is Scotland turn itself into, a world-leading user of renewable energy. We have offshore wind, hundreds of wind turbines out there in the North Sea. We have a high percentage of our energy being delivered through that mechanism. But when you actually look at how many jobs are created, where is the local supply chain, where are those wind turbines being built, was the right investment made and the right industrial strategy put in place to make sure that those jobs could be Scottish jobs, and that we could transition workers who had the skills and had the ability to do that work, then it has been an absolutely scandalous failure on the part of our Scottish and UK governments to deliver the sort of transition that we needed to create those jobs and to create that investment. We've also been looking more widely. If you look at our energy systems just now, they are broken. Our energy markets are in failure here in the UK. Energy prices are soaring, companies are collapsing, and the big energy companies are all squealing at the government to help them to underwrite their profits, to up the cap on energy prices, to give them some level of protection. And this is a really, really important time for us to be making the acts that we need to take back control of our energy systems. These are the people's resources. These resources should not be simply for making profits for billionaires. We are going to face an absolute cost of living crisis for working people, and yet again, working people are going to be made to pay for the failures of the market. So this is the time that we need to start pushing really hard, and the STUC is, for a national energy company and a national infrastructure company to build the sort of infrastructure we need for the new energy systems. You only have to look at the corruption within our current construction systems, the collapse of Carillion, the way that profits were sucked out of our public sector into bosses' pockets, to see that this system is rotten, it's broken, and that we need to rethink better solutions for working people going forward. And the other thing that we've been talking to our members about and really mobilising workers about at a local and community level are our transport systems. So transport is absolutely a major part of the transition to net zero. When we look at the people of Scotland, actually a third of people don't have access to a car, a third of households in Scotland. So we're looking at a situation where public transport, from the point of view of access and inclusion, is really, really important. I'm very pleased that the Scottish Government are going to be taking control of ScotRail from next year, and that we will have a nationalised ScotRail. But I'm not very pleased that the plan is to cut our rail systems expenditure by 12% and to cut our services. What we need to be doing at this time is investing in and expanding our rail services. That will be good for service users because we can keep prices low. It should be good for workers because we can create good, meaningful, low carbon employment for people, good unionised jobs, and it should also be good for the environment as we create those services. So that's something that's really important. Similarly with our buses, we have a massive challenge ahead. So we've been engaging with our trades councils across Scotland, and we've really been using Glasgow's Trades Council and their campaign around buses to really be a model for what we want to see happening across Scotland, because the only place in Scotland where buses are under public ownership and public control is in the Lothians. And it's a brilliant example because Lothian buses, where the public sector own and control that service, and it's a not-for-profit service, they have managed to see bus use and bus journeys go up. They have served their local economy and their local communities well. And that is an expanding service. It's an absolute success story. And when you look at the provision across the rest of Scotland, what you see is a very sad story of falling passenger use, of falling services to communities, of lots of profits going into the directors' pockets, and of workers having to take action to defend their terms and conditions of employment. So we want to see local authorities being challenged to do what Edinburgh did and take our buses back into public ownership. It is legally possible to do, but we also need to make sure that Scottish Government are making conditions ones that actually encourage local authorities to do that, because shamefully at the moment, the way the finances are set up, it's actually more economically attractive for local authorities to draw down money to go into public-private partnerships with the private bus companies. So we need to end that, and we need to bring our buses back into public control. The third part of what we're doing and engaging with people on is that green retrofit of housing, another very, very important area. I talked already about the fuel poverty that people are facing. You just need to know that Scotland is actually a very unequal country in terms of wealth, and cities like Glasgow and cities like Dundee have some of the highest levels of substandard housing in Europe. We have some of the highest poverty levels, and the two richest families in Scotland actually control more wealth than the poorest 20% of our whole population. That's over 1 million people. So these are the sorts of inequalities that we're dealing with, and that's why housing is a very, very important issue. So we don't just want to see grants for rich people to be able to fit fancy new boilers and workers having to come and fit those boilers who are on terrible paying conditions and probably precarious contracts. That is not the model we want to see for a green retrofit of our housing. What we want to see is a local authority-led and direct labour-delivered, house by house, street by street green retrofit that proofs our housing for the future and makes sure that it doesn't matter what income you're on, you're going to get a warm home and you're going to get a home that's fuel efficient. And that again will be a way for us to create good jobs, unionised jobs, give people a better pay and better conditions, and use the money in a more socially beneficial manner. So these are all arguments that we are actively taking forward. And I really think that that whole concept of acting local and getting really active in our workplaces and in our communities and doing real practical things that make a difference. But thinking global and linking up and sharing our story with people is really, really important. I also think that the work that the trade union movement has done in recent years to really, and this is something the STUC actually has a long tradition of, representing our people as citizens as well as workers and building strong coalitions, campaigning organisations and civic society more widely. It's always been part of our trade union tradition here in Scotland, but it's really come into its own in the years leading up to the COP, where we really have actively engaged with, the COP coalition, with all of the different civic and campaigning organisations. And I was proud to stand in Glasgow Green, not to address a crowd of trade unionists, but to address about 15,000 young global climate activists and to bring them a message of solidarity and hope from the trade union movement, because as far as I'm concerned, these are the trade unionists of tomorrow. And the trade union movement is actually 210 million workers across the world. We are very well placed to bring together all of the other social movements to really start to fight for the system change that we need, so that workers and ordinary people can have sustainable lives going forward. It's not going to happen by magic. We're going to have to fight like hell to make a difference. And that is why I salute all of the workers here in Scotland, because the fight back does start in workplaces who have taken industrial action or balloted for industrial action over the last month or so. We were criticised for bringing shame on the COP and shame on our city, but I absolutely salute those workers for using their language. So I wonder what Jimmy Reid and the Red Cloudsiders and the people who ran the UCS working 50 years ago would say to us, and I think they would tell us to be bold, to stand up, to be brave, to collectivise, to make our demands and not compromise on what working people need. Because when we join together and when we stand up and take action, we are more powerful than we can dare to imagine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ross. I'll not speak for too long because we're running behind. I hope that's okay. I'm going to pass you over straight away to Denise Christie, who's the Scottish Secretary of the Fire Brigade Union.
Thanks, Sean. Yes, not the General Secretary as introduced earlier. I think Matt would be jumping about just now. Thanks, everyone. Solidarity greetings here from the Fire Brigade Union. We've been involved in some of the climate action for a number of years now, because we believe it is an absolute industrial issue for us as a union and for our members as well. And we heard earlier on from previous contributions on what we can do as a movement, what trade unions can do to link in the climate crisis to the work that they do on the ground. And for firefighters, it's absolutely clear where the link is. We've seen the increase in flooding incidents that firefighters respond to, and we've also seen a huge increase in wildfires as well. And that's our members that are out there daily looking to make sure that they respond to these incidents and making sure they have enough resources to do that. And it's really important that we talk about that human aspect. It's important that we talk about the human stories and the impact that that can actually have. And if you look at where firefighters are placed across Scotland, they are placed in communities, whether it's on the islands, whether it's in the North Islands, whether it's in the central belt, in our cities, in our towns and our villages. And if we're looking to mobilise our members and our movement to challenge some of the narrative of the climate crisis, then firefighters are absolutely well placed there to do that. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the incidents that firefighters attend and how really serious this climate crisis is. In 2017, we have seen an increase from 624 wildfire incidents in Scotland in 2017 up to 2,329 wildfire incidents. And that's on the increase every single year. And it's on an increase because the grounds are getting drier and drier and drier. The wood's getting drier and drier and drier. And firefighters are out there responding to that for days on end. 30, 40, 50 firefighters, 8, 9, 10 of fire appliances, taken away from the communities and the towns and the villages where they're placed to deal with these incidents. And that has a knock-on effect to response times within their own town. So if you can imagine, if you live in a town or a village or a city, and you know where your fire station is, if that fire applies and those firefighters are out in the moorlands fighting wildfires for days on end, that fire station is lying empty. There's no fire appliance there. And if there's another road traffic collision or a fire or another incident within your neighbourhood, then it will take longer for that fire appliance to turn out to that. I mean, seconds really are important in a life or death situation in my profession. So it's not just about firefighters responding to these incidents for days on end and the amount of resources that they have. It's the gap that they're leaving in their towns and their cities, where us as citizens are actually having a negative impact because of the climate change. And you don't actually think about it like that. You don't think, what's the climate emergency got to do with a fire station, 2 miles down the road from where I live? Well, it does. If your house is on fire, and there's not a fire engineer to respond, and of course it's going to have that impact, on us as communities as well. And that's exactly the same with flooding incidents. Our roads are flooded, our lands are getting flooded, and firefighters are again there days and days and days on end, actually not know what to do, because where's that flooding water going to go? You can't pump it into somebody else because that place is flooded. You can't pump it over there because that place is flooded. So the work that we're doing is diversifying. We're going out there and we're rescuing people from these floods. At the same time as firefighters, families' homes are also flooded because they work and they live in these communities as well. And they're responding to these incidents where the roads are also flooded. And again, that's taking longer. So that road that you could get down to that house fire in 5 minutes' time may take half an hour because you have to do a huge 10-20 mile detour because those roads and those fields are flooded. So it's not just about the impact the climate emergency has in relation to what firefighters currently respond to, it's the impact it has on us and our communities as well. And we absolutely need investment in our public services to respond to this emergency. We're dealing with it just now. We were dealing with it 5-10 years ago. So we're not looking at, can we get to zero emissions in 10 years' time, etc. My members are looking at what they can do now because they have a can-do attitude. Firefighters will go out there and they'll have a can-do attitude. But that can-do attitude is extremely difficult if you've not got the resources there to respond to these incidents. And the Scottish Government have recently put out for consultation a framework for the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. And it's their vision of what the service should be in the future. It's their vision to what firefighters and the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service should be responding to. I'm just going to read out a little part from that framework. And this is the expectations it has on firefighters. And we welcome this. This is not a criticism. We absolutely welcome this. Because in Scotland, we have got a statutory duty to respond to flooding. England don't. There's a different dynamics in the politics of the governments as well. And they go on to say that the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service must continue to address and prepare for new challenges as Scotland faces more extremes of weather. So they're recognising it. The government's recognising that. And the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service must be sufficiently equipped to deal with the effects from wildfires and flooding in particular. We completely agree with that. However, we need the resources in there to back up those statements. So in the last 10 years, we've lost just under 1,000 firefighters in Scotland. In the last year, we've lost about 135 firefighter jobs in Scotland. So it's these ambitions, it's great to have these statements and these frameworks, but that must be backed up with investment. You can't ask firefighters to do more with less resources. So our call today, and our call right throughout, the debates within COP26 and the fringe meetings, and I'll just give a little plug, if that's okay, Chair. The FBU have got a fringe meeting at Webster's Theatre in Glasgow today at 1:30. We are launching our film, Firefighters on the Front Line of the Climate Emergency. It's got some fantastic personal contributions from firefighters and also firefighters working in our operational fire control room. Because these are the individuals that are getting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of calls into the control room to mobilise fire appliances, mobilise officers, etc. to these incidents. So it's not just about firefighters and fire stations on the ground, it's those within an operational fire control rooms, it's those firefighters working and retained and involved in the duty systems, it's our officer members working right across Scotland as well. So this is a kind of call out. If you want to come along to Webster's Theatre at 1:30, you'll hear first hand from the FBU General Secretary Matt Rack. You'll hear from frontline firefighters working in the control room and working across Scotland. You'll probably hear maybe a similar speech from myself as well, but you can turn off to that. But yeah, thanks for your indulgence. Appreciate the welcome. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to pass to our last speaker, which is Dipti Bhatnagar. Now, obviously, one of the reasons that we're here is because of COP. This is the People's Summit.
Hi everyone, my name is Dipti Bhatnagar. I work with Friends of the Earth International and Justiça Ambiental, Friends of the Earth Mozambique. Really happy to be speaking virtually on this panel. This Just Transition Hub is a really important space that's been organized, and I'm really glad to be a part of it from sitting at home. Of course, there are reasons why I could not be in Glasgow with all of you, and we've been raising this issue. There was an action this morning outside the COP venue, nothing about us without us. And it's really important that so many voices are missing from the space, especially the voices from the Global South. Talking about just transition, we at Friends of the Earth International, we have a certain definition of this term, and I'd like to talk to you about that. We need to be tackling the multiple interrelated crises when we talk about just transition. So this isn't just about the climate crisis, it's also about the energy crisis. 800 million people across the planet without access to electricity, 600 million of whom live in this continent in Africa. The inequality crisis that we're facing, the biodiversity crisis, the health crisis in the form of this pandemic, which has killed 5 million people on record, but who knows what the real numbers are, who knows the extent to which lives have been devastated by this pandemic and by these health crises, the biodiversity crisis that we're facing, unemployment crisis of survival, people struggling to put food on the table, which so many of the speakers also talked about. So for us, just transition is about having a social justice approach, a gender justice approach, a class justice approach, while we talk about climate justice, and for us to be very intentional and clear about what we are saying about these terms. As Asad was saying earlier, all of our terms are going to be co-opted by those in power. I guarantee you every single term is going to be co-opted by them and is going to be used in a way that we no longer recognize. Doesn't mean we need to stop using them, but it means that we need to be very clear and intentional about what we want and what is the meaning behind the terms as we see it, and how do we put power into those terms and those concepts and those struggles and movements. So for us, just transition is about disrupting power relations, because that is really important to bring about system change that we need to stop climate change, as Sean said in the very beginning. So in terms of the energy system, we need to see a complete transformation of the energy system, supporting the workers who are currently being ground right now in the current energy system, in the fossil fuel industry. We need to see energy as a common good, not as a commodity. There are certain principles that need to accompany this transformation of the energy system. It isn't just a transformation of the energy source, it's a transformation of the energy system, which means we need certain principles. We need to talk about energy sufficiency so that there is enough for everybody, but not abuse and excess for some and nothing for others. Of course, we need to be talking about renewable energy, but also about ownership. Who owns those renewable energy systems? We're calling for socially owned, community-controlled renewable energy systems. We need to think about the materials. Where does that come from? And Asad was talking about that. In the global Green New Deal conversations, we need to make sure that this is not going to increase extractivism in the global south to feed a certain notion of a renewable energy system in the north. This is really important. The systems need to be people-centered, and we need to remove the obstacles to this kind of progress that we are calling for. And of course, we're going to need climate finance to do this. I don't need to tell all of you who are there in Glasgow right now and across the world, the COP has been, until now, the week one has been full of hype. Outside, in the media, the PR machine of the rich countries is talking about, oh, climate finance is so important, we're going to support this. Inside the negotiations, they're doing the absolute opposite. We need to hold them accountable, and we will. This isn't just about the energy system. This is also about the way that we produce our food. How do we protect those small farmers? 50% of the food consumed in the world right now is being produced by small-scale farmers. How do we protect that and support peasant agroecology? How do we stop deforestation and support those who are currently protecting the forests with community forest management? How do we challenge transnational corporations and demand a binding treaty on transnational corporations? This work has been happening as well, and there was a UN conference in Geneva 2 weeks ago trying to do this work. We need to be calling for public services. We need to be calling for a valuing of care work as part of our climate justice solutions. For us, this is what a just transition looks like, looking at all of these solutions together. One of the solutions that's not on the table for us and that we will fight against because they're false solutions, we don't even want to call them solutions, is the whole scheme of net zero carbon markets, geoengineering. This is a net zero COP. It's being called a net zero COP because this is what the UK government has been pushing throughout the world, asking countries to make net zero by 2050 commitments. You heard from Assad how problematic this is, because it's really just an escape hatch for them, for the polluters to be able to keep polluting. And at the same time, they want to financialize land. They want to financialize the forests that they don't own. They want to go and grab lands and forests from communities in the global south because they want to sequester their carbon emissions on that land. And we say, no, not acceptable. Rich countries need to stop emissions at source. Global South countries need to do the exact same thing. We do not want to see fossil fuels. We do not want to see export-oriented, big business-centered, elite-centered development in our countries. We want to see people-centered development in our countries that gives people a life of dignity. Two more things I'll mention quickly. In September, Friends of the Earth Africa released a Just Recovery Renewable Energy Plan for Africa. We've got copies available in Glasgow. I don't think at the venue right now, but we can get them to you through Ryan. So basically, we modeled the renewable energy potential in Africa, and it meets our needs. It's technically and feasibly possible. It's financially possible because there's a whole lot of money that, it's going to take a lot of money to do that. but that's about repayment of the climate debt from the global north to the global south. And that needs to happen. And that is going to help continent like Africa and the rest of the global south to be able to have that just and feminist transition for our communities and our people. And it has the potential to create 7 million jobs, is what the modeling shows. Lastly, I want to talk about what we are releasing today. Friends of the Earth International is releasing a brand new report called If It's Not Feminist, It's Not Just. And Ryan has copies there in the room. And of course, there may not be enough copies, so we would share the link with you. I can share the link in the chat a little bit, and then it can be shared with all of you there. And we're looking at women's perspectives, the women being protagonists of the change. And we are pushing for that just and feminist transition, valuing of care work, and looking at all of these solutions together. And we're really happy to launch this report today at the Just Transition Hub with all of you, and to be a part of building this transition and building this work together. It's not going to be easy, but we need to do it because lives are at stake and because everyone deserves a life of dignity, and that is the work that we want to do together. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, and thanks for joining. Sorry about the technical difficulties that we had at the start. Just to thank all the speakers in the previous session. The next session that we're going to start as soon as we can